All right, Sprocket. So what's the issue with the dumpster flow video?
Well, no. Hold on. I want to do this a slightly different way.
Okay, perfect. You do it.
Because I, cool. Yeah, because I feel like we don't have a clear thesis to discuss the video. So, TLDR it for me. What do you take out of this video? Like, why? What was going through your mind when you linked it to me? What thesis would you extract and say that's the thing I wanted Sprocket to get?
So what I wanted you to get is probably a bit different because I didn't necessarily want you to get anything but a boner out of someone talking about logic.
Yeah, very
But it
poorly.
seems it worked. It didn't work. Yeah, okay, sure.
It fucking ruined my logic boner. But yeah, go ahead.
So what I wanted in general to, or what I see people getting out of this, is actually introducing an appreciation of logic to the left. That is it is kind of underappreciated as a function to refine ideas, to check ideas, to check ideas for consistency, and so on. So I figured dumpster flower, like doing it in a, of course, not like perfectly academic way, I suppose, because like his formalizations were off and his examples were often simple, and some of them turns out to be wrong. But we'll get into that. So for me, the most important bit there was that while we should and will and must use logic to be consistent, to be reach correct ideas of any capacity, and to have anything valuable to say, we must also consider at a certain time what is the discourse around logic, and why are the right-wingers and reactionaries and anti-SJWs so firmly claiming logic, and what is it they're failing to do by not like actually being logical, but rather inferring assumptions from logic that don't derive from logic inherently, which is basically moral axioms. What it amounts to ultimately in dumpster flow thing. Like the thesis, if anything, is logic is good, but it has its limits. Its limits are that we can't derive moral axioms from logic purely, but people doing so or pretending to do so are harmful discourse. I guess that's the point.
Okay, so to address this point by point, we agree this particular video. I mean, even just as far as its understanding of logic is quite poor. The individual in this video, I don't know his name.
Dumpster flower.
Dumpster Flower. Yeah, sure, Mr. Dumpster Flower. Doctor Dumpster Flower. Um, doesn't seem to have a terribly tight grasp on logic, right? Is this fair? And I think this kind of sets up my issue with the video in the ways that he kind of misleads with it. So I understand. I think there are sort of two poster children for what he's talking about, right? And I would say those two names are Ben Shapiro and Sam Harris, right?
Yeah.
Ben Shapiro being the sort of, facts don't care about your feelings guy, and Sam Harris being the we can derive moral claims from science. I think that's roughly not Ben Shapiro, Sam Harris's position anyway. So it is an admirable effort to try and tear down these very bad arguments that these individuals are making. Sorry, I have these bumps in my tongue. They're not doing good, buddy.
These bumps are shit.
Fuck these bumps. Let me gather my thoughts here for a second. I can't find the fucking doctor in this goddamn game. You shouldn't have recorded me. You fucked everything up. I was on a roll. I had everything in my head. So the key thing. Let me pivot to this. The key thing that I took out of the dumpster flower video, which is patently incorrect, is that logic is somehow fundamentally different in its application to ethics than it is to, say, science, right? So he actually makes a little bit of an error here. He correctly states that logic can't tell you about the truth of your premises. Now, he goes on to say something curious. I don't know how relevant this is, but this is a pretty major error, and I feel it worth pointing out. He goes on to say that logicians can somehow use truth tables to establish the truth of premises. That's absolutely not true. That's not what truth tables do. And I don't know why he said that or exactly what he thinks. I'm not sure what he's thinking logic is, or why he would even make this offhand comment.
What is the like quote in question? Can you like?
Let me see. I have a list of timestamps.
Oh yeah. I'll open up
it's
the
a-
video and you name me the timestamp. That's probably the best
Yep.
way.
1754.
Okay. Let me quickly search it up.
Somewhere around here. I might have written down off by like 5 or 10 seconds, but you know.
Long truth tables to then check the truth of
Okay.
premises,
Yeah, bit back.
generally based on a number of premises which are not true. So these arguments are valid, but not sound. So in order to actually determine the truth of any logical position, you still need to test the truth of the premises. Now, some serious logician people do long truth tables to then check the truth of premises and show which combinations of truth still support the conclusion in order.
Okay, so I can at least tell from the pictures he's showing that he means like more complex premises, like what aren't premises, which is a wrongly used term. But he's showing like in brackets P and Q and such things. P and Q imply R, or shit like this. He means that those can be are posited as premises in his like words, but that's wrong, and we know it. But then it is true that you can make truth tables to like check if like P and R implies Q or whatever is consistent with another logical statement. That's a mistake. I
Sure.
think he named premise but meant like a logical statement that's like with multiple operators.
The reason I call this such an egregious error is I think the issue that he's having is not understanding the role of logic in relation to premises. So let me put it this way. He makes a comment at some point. I think it's at, I have my timestamps here. I think it's at 36:45.
Let me look.
Yeah, 36:45. I can TLDR it and then you can watch it or whatever
Okay.
order you want to do that in. So he says something like the ideas of ethics and gender and race and all of these topics are not reducible to pure logic. Where the fuck am I? Dark Shore? I don't know where this is. I'm so lost. I'm so fucking confused. I'm just looking for a doctor. God damn it. This is a fucking nightmare. He argues that these things are not reducible to pure logic. Essentially nothing is reducible to pure logic except pure logic. So this is where I want to just say the following thing, because I think a lot of what he says can be said very, very concisely. Logic is the study of a valid argumentative structure. Or I think a slightly better way to put this is that it's the study of truth-preserving arguments. So truth-preserving in the sense that it studies arguments with the property that if the premises of the argument is true, then the conclusions of the argument are necessarily true as well. This is what logic studies. Now, he makes a comment around 36:45, which seems to indicate he doesn't totally understand the relationship between science, logic, ethics, all of these things. Understanding that this is what logic does. Science is not somehow reducible to pure logic either, but he seems to he makes a claim to the effect of, oh, logic hits a snag when dealing with ethics because you can argue these different things in different frameworks. This is universally true, right? Depending on the premises, there's no. I don't want to say that you can't logically argue in favor of premises, but the way you do that is by taking another set of premises and arguing for that premise. So if I say, okay, I have premises P1 and P2, and I derive conclusion C, you might say, well, I disagree with conclusion premise P1. Then I might say, well, okay, can you accept premises P1 prime and P2 prime? And maybe you say yes, and then I say, okay, well, I can deduce P1 from P1 prime and P2 prime. So I don't want to say that there's absolutely no way to argue in favor of premises in practice, but the point is, at some point, you always go all the way back to some premise. So this is equally true in science. You still take premises, and logic isn't somehow more compatible with science. I'm not even sure what he's saying here. I don't know why he's trying to distinguish logic's relationship with science from ethics' relationship with science.
Let me listen to the bit in question and then reply, because I've already got an idea.
They tried bringing these methods into deeper societal problems like race relations and gender using logic, which, as I noted before, kinda has this... As
go
we have
back
seen,
quite a bit.
logic can't in itself solve social problems without reference to forces outside itself, like science and ethics, in order to generate premises. So these claims are effectively meaningless, whether true or not, and only serve as some sort of appeal to authority, saying, I use logic, so I must be clever. Basically an attempt to give their point more gravitas by claiming to be actively using logic, which, as I noted before, kinda has this reputation of being something like academic magic. I think in some ways this might be a tendency that hangs over from the move of many new atheists and so-called rational skeptics.
Yeah, I think I found the point. So what he says is that logic in itself can't answer questions about societal problems without reference to something external to logic, like science or ethics.
Is this a direct quote?
Yes.
I don't recall this being what he said, so I also want to listen to the quote, if that's
Okay. Yeah, I went back at least to I think 36 minutes and 5 seconds or something like this. Around there he says it.
All right, let me do this, and I'll stick it on 2 times speed just so I can...
Yeah, sure.
Okay. But then he goes on. So yes, I agree. The direct quote that you quoted here, yes, I think what he says is correct. If I'm not misinterpreting the grammar. But then he goes on to say, I want to quote this directly. Hold on, let me listen to this.
Okay, so the immediately next part I wanted to say is like the part about that logic is sometimes used and seen like academic magic. That's very important for the framing, I guess.
Yes, that is an extremely... I really like that quote. Logic is viewed as a kind of academic magic that as soon as you say, I'm being logical, people go, oh shit, he's being fucking logical. But then he goes on to say, issues like politics and race relations or something like that are not reducible to pure logic. Let me, hold on. I want an exact quote. I don't want to misquote him.
Oops, wrong browser.
Okay, so they tried doing logic with material and metaphysical ideas like science, and myth and disproving God, while these annotations are not that great, where it can be a more effective tool, and then try applying the same methods to issues like politics and race relations. Logic is not more or less effective depending on the thing you apply it to. If you want truth-preserving arguments, the thing you go to is logic, right? It doesn't matter what the underlying topic is.
So
now, unless you think truth-preserving argumentation is less important in the context of race relations and social issues, I don't understand what this claim means. Why is he trying to distinguish science, or because he's talking about skeptics, right? And he seems to be indicating that the skeptics have correctly applied logic to issues like God, and then applied it in the same way to social issues and have failed because that application isn't as effective. I have absolutely no idea what this means.
Okay, actually, okay. Let me just check the part out again, because I think it's an issue of discourse, so we need to get the framing right.
Sure.
YouTubers to the far right. They tried doing logic with material and metaphysical ideas like science vs myth and disproving God, where it can be a more effective tool, and then they tried bringing these methods into deeper societal problems like race relations and gender politics, and don't realise that these areas, by necessity, operate partially outside the realm of logic due to their moral nature.
Yeah, it's a weird juxtaposition, but I would say for a different reason. The reason why I think it's a weird juxtaposition is that he said material things and like disproving God. And disproving God, like, by necessity, God and disproving God cannot like happen on any material grounds, because you cannot disprove God. It's just not even like, no matter what logic you use, you can't really disprove God, right? Because a religious person could just always appeal that God transcends. This is why I think, if anything, you can't even like, to the same degree fail to conclusively solve the issue of God with logic as you fail to solve the issue of social problems with logic, right?
Yes, well, again, all of these things, he seems to imply that you need to appeal to something external, and that's absolutely true. To apply logic, you need to appeal to something external to verify your premises, right? So when you're arguing that, I don't know, fuck, I'm trying to come up with some like good scientific example. You're doing something in the realm of ecology, and you're trying to say, these wolves developed this trait for these evolutionary reasons, and you say, well, that can't really be correct. Because we know these things about genetics, and then you can argue logically, if this is true, and we know this from genetics, then this also has to, be true, and therefore this ecological claim is false. Whatever. I wanted to come up with a concrete example, and I couldn't think of anything.
Yeah, I gotcha.
But again, this is universally true. I mean, you understand what I'm saying? That he is very, very clearly distinguishing science, metaphysics, and the arguments against God, in saying these are somehow fundamentally different from social issues. I mean, I feel like this is the key thing.
I guess a way to come at it is to think about what the didactic purpose of the video is. Is it an introduction to logic in a formal way? No. What it is seems to be a discussion of the logic surrounding discourse. And while his statements are sloppy, and we can agree they are sloppy, in this case, I would say it's not him saying that you cannot use, it's not him saying that applying logic to the premises of, social issues is any worse. Rather, he's just kind of conflating things. And here's what I would think it is conflating. That race relations and gender and other social issues are necessarily not based on anything material, while at least in the way in which these people debunk God, like the atheist community and so on, based their claims on lots of things that you could observably prove to be true, like things you could derive from nature and take from nature, or rather, I think they did, right? I'm not completely mistaken, because I felt like they were talking about science and brains and all this kind of shit to disprove God. Or, correct me if I'm wrong. Because I'm going somewhere. Just about the atheist community. Am I framing them right? Because I've never watched their stuff.
Yeah. I don't know. I did when I was younger. Yeah, that seems like a reasonable characterization.
So, and the difference, when we come to the question of gender, for example, how can we even make true statements about gender? It is not something. It is something we observe in human behavioral patterns, but we have given a label to, and the label isn't even agreed upon among most people. So in order to derive a premise from gender, we first need to clear up all the premises, which is obvious. We need to do this for every logical discussion. But it seems that in the way the online community discusses gender, this seems to be the point where most discussions begin and end. Just the definition, because the most discussions seem to amount to simply this: the discussion about definitions. Have you genuinely have you encountered many gender discussions with people who are saying there are only two genders, who budged on their position because they realized gender is just a thing we assign to behavioral patterns, and there's not necessarily a reason to limit it to two? That's not what happens, right?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. There aren't individuals who accept the notion of gender as a socially constructed societal role, and still argue that there are two genders, right?
Yes.
I don't think I've ever met such a person. Yes, I will. I'll concede this.
And then the problem is, if we,
it feels like we're hedging a lot for him, man. This is not what he said.
We're hedging, but now I'm coming to what he said, which is that let's rephrase it into logic doesn't seem to be a useful tool when discussing gender-related issues, for example, right? That's a fair characterization of what he's saying?
Yeah.
Then I think from if we observe how discussions, let's take online discussions, let's take a Walsh debate with someone who is explaining gender to for the 10,000th times. Then logic is not where you can get the person, because they will disagree with you on setting the premises. They will not engage you with your premises. And if two people in a debate trying to use logic are not agreeing on the premises, and one side refuses to take the premises of the other person, even if it's provably, or not provably, but even if it's conceptually true, gender as a social construct is true. It is just true. from our sociological understanding and so on. But if the other party refuses to take that and just says, no, it's not true because sex and like does faulty premises, sure, you can point out their faulty premises. But is it a useful way to debate them in a factual sense? In achieving something to convince those people, or rather to move those people in those positions?
No, probably not, I guess. But then, if your goal is to convince people, logic is essentially useless. I mean,
I guess we're running into a big problem here,
if you're
right?
trying to convince people, pure rhetoric is what you want. You want to
Yeah.
beat your chest about principles. You want to shame people. You want to make them feel bad. You want to use social pressure. These are the ways to convince people.
Yeah.
If you're looking to convince people, fuck logic. Fuck any kind of deductive reasoning. Just shame people into agreeing with you. I mean, that's the correct, right?
It seems to be for like the masses. It would seem to be the most effective strategy. Yes, absolutely. But here's the thing: like, this is kind of where we want to get, and I think we can get there by like talking about logic in this way, which is that we do realize that we must check the consistency of our positions using logic, which is what Dumpsterfloor, I think, highlighted in the majority of the first half of the video. And then he transitioned over to critique the skeptic community for doing a poor job at that, and for online discourse not using logic as an effective tool. Or rather, well, that's where he probably fucked up the most, where he said that logic isn't an effective tool for the online discussions about social issues, which I would disagree with. It isn't currently an effective tool, but we should like work to make it an effective tool. Like we should reach the levels where we can engage debates with intellectual honesty to the point where, like, if it turns out that your premises are either wrong or that your what you derive from your premises is wrong, that you can be pointed out that it is so wrong, and that you then change your mind on it. But you know, I don't know. I think for me, Dumpsterfloor's video had in itself like a positive message about using logic in political discourse, but it took a critical lens on how skeptics misuse logic as a discursive device.
But it did so by completely misrepresenting logic, using these. You can call them sloppy, but let's not mince words here. They're wrong. Everything he almost, I don't say almost everything he said, greater than 50% of his key claims about logic were just wrong as stated. You can call them sloppy. You can say that, oh, if only he had changed his wording a little bit, he'd have been correct. But as stated, they are incorrect. They are false. And I don't believe that he has a genuine understanding of the role of logic in argumentation.
I mean, I don't know if it's more than 50%. That seems like a very big number.
I hedged a bit by saying his key claims. Yes, every time he said something that I would consider substantial, maybe there's a bit of sampling bias here, I would say with great frequency what he said was outright incorrect. You can call it sloppy, but sloppy to the point of being incorrect. I mean, again, I have this quite long list of this whole list of notes I have is essentially lists of him saying things which are just false. So, I don't know. I mean, I understand what you're saying in the sense that I do not think this is what he meant. That, oh, it's not necessarily useful to use logic in discourse with so-called rationalist skeptic types because they tend not to respond to it, because they tend not to agree on definitions. I don't know that this is actually what he meant. This feels very much like a stretch.
Okay.
I mean, what I'm saying,
Yeah.
I feel like I've sort of Occam's razor found a much better explanation. This is a guy who has some limited philosophy background, maybe took some sort of symbolic logic course in university, didn't totally understand it, spent 20 or 30 minutes talking about it, and got most of the things he said wrong. Talked a lot about Wittgenstein, didn't get quite as much wrong, but still some pretty wrong, misleading things. Makes
We
these
can
really
talk about
sloppy
this
claims.
afterwards.
Yeah. We can talk about Wittgenstein specifically. I'd have to remind myself. I didn't rewatch the Wittgenstein part, so I'll have to remind myself exactly what issue I took. But
But let's continue here first.
yeah, but let's continue here. And then he's making claims which seem rather apparent. He's trying to distinguish logic as applied in science from logic as applied in ethics or other social issues. he's trying to distinguish these things somehow, and we can kind of speculate that maybe what he meant is, oh, there's something fundamentally non-material about ethics. Yeah, I guess, but you still have premises. Logic doesn't, because I know with certainty he uses the phrase logic runs into a snag when you apply it to ethics or something like that. He says runs into a snag. Or he says there's a problem with using logic in ethics, or it's not quite as effective. These are just false claims. Logic it does the exact same thing that it does in every other context. It tells you how to argue in a truth-preserving way. It does the exact same thing. It's not different.
Quoting maybe, or misquoting, or paraphrasing Wittgenstein's cage sentence. Oh god, do you know the quote of Wittgenstein, "The walls of our cage"?
I don't know. Let's look it up. Walls of our cage.
This run against the walls of our cage is perfectly, absolutely hopeless. Ethics, so far as it springs from the desire to say something about the ultimate meaning of life, the absolute good, the absolute valuable, can be no science. What it says does not add to our knowledge in any sense, but it is a document of a tendency in the human mind which I personally cannot help respecting deeply, and I would not for my life ridicule it. It's the Wittgenstein quote.
Sure. So I'm a little less familiar with Wittgenstein's ethics takes, but yeah, I mean, saying it can be no science, I guess I'm feeling like I'm lacking a bit of context here, and I'm not even sure. To be clear, I'm not like a complete Wittgenstein stan here. There's quite a number of things he said that I'm not in agreement on. There are certain things you have to be a little bit careful about with Wittgenstein because he tended to overextend his reach without really having the analytic background to do it. He was no Russell. He was no Frege. So yeah, I don't know that what Dumpster Flower is claiming is really the same thing as what Wittgenstein is claiming. I think Wittgenstein is more making claims about ethics as treated. Maybe more making a statement about moral realism as a position, about whether or not moral facts can be discovered in the world. I mean, if this is all Dumpster Flower meant, I guess, but that still doesn't make sense as to why ethics is somehow less conducive to logic. It still feels like a non-response.
I guess. So, what I think, and this is unclear, is that it's, like, as I said, talking about discourse, and that maybe the implication of its logic is not as good of a tool here as, like, whatever, somewhere else, is due to the fact that you can probably reach people on issues of ethics. Like most people, you could reach better with appeals that don't necessarily rely on logic to make the argument. For example, appeals to emotion, appeals to principles, appeals to well, not necessarily logic, but like the personal best interest that doesn't necessarily need to rely on like logic or anything, you know, or like just talking about cause and effect in political implications without like necessarily putting on an ethical lens. I guess people would then intuitively like gravitate towards something. I guess that's like the main claim, that at some point, you know, I think I'm with you on the criticism. I'm not like completely whitewashing it. I think it's a bit short-sighted to say that, or rather, even what I'm saying he's saying right now is a bit short-sighted about the use of logic, because it kind of like implies that the most people would just rather be convinced by gut feeling rather than like having a consistent logical ethical system. But you know, where am I going with this? Where I'm going is to say that I think it's a way of... It's kind of like treating people as if they weren't... It's kind of saying ethics and logic is hard, therefore let's try and do something else. Or hard to do correctly.
Yeah, I guess, but it depends on what you mean by let's do something else. If your goal is to convince people, fuck logic. It's literally useless. No, it's not literally useless. It is
academic magic. It's a tool to appear as in a certain
The
way.
aesthetic of logic is very useful. That is extremely useful, as evidenced by people like Ben Shapiro.
If you can
but-
use that while doing correct logic, that would be very dope.
Yeah. I mean, you would really be convincing people, but unfortunately, the aesthetic of logic and actual logic tend to be very, very different. What we feel is logical tends not to actually be all that logical.
So I guess the takedown of logic in this Dumb Stuff Love video is more or less a takedown of the aesthetic of logic, while going about it the wrong way and like claiming that logic shouldn't be applied to ethics like this because it isn't very useful, rather than explaining how exactly it's a wrong application, how there could be a right application. But I don't think he fails to mention how important logic in general is for like consistency of positions. So we're kind of like having a balance here of this part seems to misrepresent it to some extent, but it exists in the context of a video which has already talked about the benefits of logic. Then we have a quote which seems to contradict the quote I gave you earlier, which said that like to do proper logic we need the externalities of science and ethics to actually make claims and so on, which is true and works, but you know, we have claims that sound like he is disregarding this himself. So it's kind of hard to make sense of it. So if anything, we find like in the video kind of inherent contradictions which either speak to the dual purpose of the like discursive function of the video, to whom it is trying to appeal, what it is trying to say to those people, and also like the educational function that it fails to completely or achieve well, I want to say. Right, is that something we can see?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I'd agree to all that. Then shit, I don't know. I guess I don't really know what else to say then.
Okay, then we can talk about Wittgenstein, because I've picked up some things. Because he has been very... I looked up a lecture Wittgenstein gave about ethics in general.
Sure.
And he actually seemed to believe the position that as a philosopher you should not make ethical claims. He just like he said even in the Tractatus he said that you cannot speak of issues like aesthetics, ethics, and metaphysical. Therefore, one should not make claims of them. This is kind of like what he says. Like, is that already a reading you disagree with, like of the Tractatus? Because even the Dumb Stuff Law video, it is kind of like derived, right? That you cannot make claims about these things, and if one cannot make claims about things, one should not talk of them. That's the meme Wittgenstein quote.
Yeah. Oh God. I don't know. I mean, that ending axiom had a lot of double meanings, but
I guess
it was partially sarcastic. It was partially what you're saying right now. Yeah. My issue in general is that Tractatus is not Wittgenstein's key work. His key work is in philosophy of language and philosophy of logic. Tractatus is just not... It's a work that he later looked back on and said, this is kind of shit. He very much distanced himself from it later in his life. So I don't know. Trying to even discuss Tractatus feels a bit...
Okay, let's not discuss
like arguing
Tractatus.
with nothing substantial.
Yeah.
So, and the issue is like I don't know. The key things that I'm familiar with Wittgenstein on are his philosophy of language and philosophy of logic.
The philosophy of
the
language
connection
ties
between
into this strongly, into the ethical stance Wittgenstein has, as you probably would have guessed. So I read I read the lecture on an ethics that he gave, which is years after Tractatus. So he has already arrived at a point where he was already considering it to be a kind of shit work, or whatever.
Right.
I don't think he did. He think it was shit? I want to know.
I don't know exactly. I don't think he was
Okay.
fond of it. No.
Okay, so basically what he said is that let me pull up the screenshots I made. Only facts express meaning. Absolute value judgments are not facts or empirical statements and cannot be restated as facts or as empirical statements. Therefore, if ethical expressions concern only absolute value judgments, then ethical expressions lack meaning. This is what he basically is his argument. And if we want to talk about absolute judgment versus relative judgment, which is a distinction he makes, we could talk about like if we're saying like, is this bus good? A bus, right? The public transport bus. Is this bus good?
Sure.
We first need to ask, okay, in what way do we mean good? So we could say, is this bus good to get me from this city to the next city? And we could look at the bus timetable and like the time it travels and compare it with other alternatives of public transit. And we could say, yes, this bus is good. By comparison, we can judge this bus is good to getting us from this city to that city. And then we have made a relative judgment. But an absolute judgment is something like a scientific truth or something. And he says, like, you cannot make these in terms of ethics and aesthetics and metaphysics.
Okay. Sorry, what was the initial question?
I was just basically explaining Wittgenstein's argument to see whether or not we can talk about ethics. His final definition proposes that if a statement is ethical, then it must be an absolute value judgment. But because ethics statements talk about the absolutely right road as opposed to merely the right road, according to Wittgenstein, and because only facts can express meaning, ethical statements are not based on facts. Therefore, ethical statements cannot express meaning. That's Wittgenstein's position. So basically, reiterating, one cannot talk about ethics except like maybe in a context of relative judgment. Therefore, you cannot like have ethics, but rather just like relative judgments depending on the case, on the language game.
So the reason I'm pausing for a moment here because I want to see what Wittgenstein's position was on mathematics. So the reason I bring that up, this is often the comparison I use, is that ethics has the exact same ontological status as mathematics, right?
Okay.
And what I mean by that is when we make a claim like it is immoral to kill someone, that has the same weight, the same kind of meaning, the same kind of truth to it that a statement like 7 is prime does, right? So the sense in which 7 is prime... Okay, we can interpret that statement in a couple ways, right? The statement 7 is prime has a corresponding... plural. Has corresponding facts. There are corresponding facts about the world. God, I keep fucking up my sentence. There are facts about the world which correspond to a statement like 7 is prime. For example, if I have 7 apples, I can't distribute them among my friends in a non-trivial way, right? I can't distribute them evenly among my friends in a non-trivial way. So that, okay, you might say that it's a little bit different from ethics in that sense, but I mean, there's a different kind of 7 is prime statement that I can make, which is that the symbol 7, there's a formal system in which that symbol lives, and we're only allowed to write certain statements involving that symbol based on the fact that, quote, 7 is prime, right?
Yeah, I gotcha.
So there are two different kinds of statements. That second kind of statement, I argue that ethical statements are like that kind of statement. In some sense, I take a purely formalist approach to ethics. So are you familiar with the different sort of, in philosophy of mathematics, you have like the logicist school, the formalist school, the constructivist school, these different sort of schools of thought?
Hit me with it.
So the formalists essentially say that, well, okay, here's another comparison. The ontological content of mathematics is as weighty as the ontological content of the rules of chess, right? So when I say that a queen can only move in these ways, a statement like 7 is prime has the exact same ontological content. Now, I used to be a very strong formalist mathematically. I've since changed my tune on that. The reason being, because it seems like 7 is prime can mean two different kinds of things. It can refer to something, it can refer to properties of a symbol in a formal system, but there is also corresponding facts about the world. Whereas ethics doesn't necessarily seem to have the same thing. That may not even be true, but I don't know, maybe I'll sort that out as I'm talking about it. So we construct ethical systems for the exact same reason that we construct formal systems to reason about, prime numbers. So where I'm going with all of this is I think I'm going to disagree with Wittgenstein in a very fundamental way here, which is that I don't view he almost seems to propose that if there is such a thing as ethics, then you have to take a kind of moral realist position. The moral realist position is wrong, therefore there aren't meaningful ethical claims you can make. This seems to be his sort of syllogism.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm just disagreeing with the premise that if you talk about ethics, you're taking some kind of moral realist position. No, I don't assert that moral facts are things that can be discovered in the world, any more than I argue that the rules of chess can be discovered in the world anywhere. So I feel like Wittgenstein just didn't have the conception of ethics that. I don't know. I think he viewed ethics as something a little more boxed in than he should. And I think a lot of people do this. I think a lot of people make the correct observation that claims like murder is wrong can't be discovered in nature, but that doesn't mean that they can't be meaningful within some given formal system and within some broader language game around which we build around that formal system.
Hence relative judgment, I guess.
Yes. So I when he says absolute, I think I wish he was more clear here. I don't like phrases like absolute, objective, subjective, relative. These are meaningless.
Let me look.
Specific. Go ahead. Yeah.
If I have anything on that. Relative value judgments can be restated as facts. This road is right if you want to be at that place by a certain time. Absolute value judgments, however, cannot be restated as facts. The absolutely right road does not confer any factual content. Does this help in any capacity?
Yeah, this is what I mean when I say he almost seems to purport that if there is such a thing as ethics, then you have to be some kind of moral realist about it. That if there are such things as moral statements, then there are such things as moral facts, but there are no moral facts because they can't be statements about the world. So I mean, yeah, I guess this is just my fundamental disagreement. I argue that ethics is much more like chess or much more like mathematics in the formalist sense than it is like science or like.
It's supposed we have to see it within like Wittgenstein's, I want to almost say megalomania, which is like what he expressed in Tractatus, which is trying to solve philosophy or whatever, what philosophy can talk about in general. And he said that philosophy cannot talk about ethics because there can be no factual judgments to be made. It seems like to dismiss it far too quickly, and I also disagree with it. But why I'm going into this is the interesting thing that this seems to be lining up with Dumpster Flaw's position in the video.
Yeah, maybe. I still think you're assigning a little more.
I mean,
I
no, I'm
just a little too generous to him. But maybe.
I mean, he talks about Wittgenstein extensively and quotes like many of the things I've also talked about. Like, no, he quotes mainly from the Tractatus. But since I wanted to know, okay, what is Wittgenstein's detailed position on ethics, I just searched for this lecture on ethics and so on and so on. So, in my view, what Dumpster Flaw does is probably has read the Wittgenstein stuff first and then like started constructing this video as like a mixture of discourse analysis. Maybe he should have established a term language game. Maybe he should have done that in the video. Like, absolutely should have. This would have probably helped. But while I also disagree with Wittgenstein and by extension with Dumpster Flaw on this conclusion ultimately, I don't know, we can disagree, but I wouldn't at that point say it's much of a misrepresentation anymore if we're like drawing on Wittgenstein, right?
Yeah, sure. I would say he's probably taking the sort of unnuanced position of earlier Wittgenstein.
Probably. Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe Wittgenstein agreed with these things later in life. I'm really not totally sure, but I'm trying to think here. Ooh, sorry.
Don't worry about it.
That's embarrassing. These bumps in my tongue, they're really killing me.
Yeah, they're making you burpy.
No, they're making me burpy, buddy. what am I trying to get at right now? I don't know. What are we trying to get at right now? Is it?
I mean, I guess we've discussed our main grievances with the dumpster flower video. I'm not sure if there's much more in this, except if you like have a enlightening addition to the discussion that would fit.
Not particularly. Even if dumpster flower is sort of mimicking Wittgenstein's position here, I really strongly disagree with Wittgenstein. I have I don't know. I think in general I have some pretty radical takes on ethics. If I'm being honest. I think most people do not accept the kind of things that I claim about ethics.
That's probably true.
So
we can go into this if you want, like if you want to lay it out, and we can discuss that.
Sure, yeah. So why I think my take on ethics is so radical? I think claiming that it has the same sort of status as mathematics is considered kind of absurd. I think we have this intuition that moral statements are somehow less, I don't know, less rigorous, less rigorizable than mathematical statements.
I mean,
but I don't think this is really true. What makes something rigorous to a mathematician is that it can be described within some formal system, and you can follow some syntactic rules to derive new syntactically well-formed propositions.
Yeah, suppose this goes into the philosophy of mathematics, right? The how we look at mathematics as a system in general. I guess to be consistent, Sprocket, you would have to say that basically the assignment that 7 is a prime is somewhat arbitrary.
Yeah, correct. Well, yeah, it depends on what you mean by arbitrary.
In the same way that saying murder is bad is arbitrary. Like, you pick some axiom somewhere and derive from that 7 is a prime, for example.
Yeah, when you say arbitrary, are you willing to expand on that? Or I don't know if you can. Maybe you were hoping that arbitrary was sort of self-descriptive enough.
I'm not sure if I have the entire terminology, but okay, let's try and compare like the ontological status of ethics and mathematics. Because intuitively, with your explanation previously, in the sense that we could see 7 as like one component of a formal system, which means that it is constituted by like the definitions of this formal system, that we should be able to derive 7 as a prime from that formal system. But this formal system inherently is like human-made, as mathematics is in a sense. And even though we can observe facts in nature about it, we basically at some point have some arbitrariness in choosing our symbols and the relations between these symbols. At least, I don't know. So
yeah,
no,
in the sense that
some arbitrariness maybe at the start of it. Like in ethics, you would say the decision whether or not I value human happiness is entirely arbitrary, but everything else I can derive from that, basically, right? This is the axiom. And in math, you also have axioms, but the difference, I guess, is that in math, the axioms can be deductively found. Like if we observe the relationship between different, like, real natural facts. Isn't that true, or is that not true? I don't know.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question?
Can we find the axioms that constitute math in nature by deductively deriving from natural facts?
No, I'm still not totally sure I understand the question, but no, not really. I mean,
so we can derive that 1 + 1 = 2 from nature, in the sense that we can take one apple, another apple, put them together, see it's 2 apples, and conclude that we like. For this to make sense, to like be truth preserving, we must have some underlying axioms that ensure that if we add one number to another, something bigger comes out. For example, like this is very bad way of formulating it, because I've never talked about philosophy of maths, of course. But I hope you know.
That's really okay. Yeah. So for me, I would just say that when you say something like 1 + 1 = 2, there's two different kind of statements you could be making. One statement is within a purely formal system, that there's, I don't know, maybe you've taken the Peano axioms, maybe you've taken ZFC, maybe you've taken God knows what. There are different ways in mathematics of formulating some underlying set of rules that you can take to formulate the concepts of mathematics and either build the integers or just have them a priori. Now, we I want to be a little bit careful about how I say this. But there's also a corresponding claim. This is why I've largely ditched the formalist position. It's not that what the formalists claim is wrong, it's that it's not right enough. It's like saying to me it's like a claim like, oh, a book is some pieces of paper bound together by leather, with ink written on each of the pages. Yeah, that is what a book is, but that's not all a book is. It's clear that a book is a little something more than that. If I hand you some scrap leather and some pieces of paper glued together and I pour ink on top of it, yeah, we can fuss about whether or not that technically constitutes a book, but
It's an art book. I don't know what you're talking about.
yeah, it's an art book. It's whatever.
Sorry.
No, it's fine, but I don't know. Is this comparison? I don't think.
I
think
understand where you're going.
Okay, I think what the formalists are doing is they're not saying enough. There's clearly more to mathematics. Sure, statements like, I don't. What, fuck, I'm trying to think of some like obscenely complicated statement. I don't know. Every a vector space, every possible cardinality has a basis. What the fuck does that even mean in nature? God knows. But I've largely moved to a position that there are at least some mathematical claims that have a clear correspondence with real things. So even if every vector space has a basis, doesn't really correspond to anything in reality. Claims like 7 is prime do. So, fuck, where was it going with all of this? Why did I bring this up? I think I was just explaining the formalist position. Do you remember why I brought this up? Where was I going with this?
So you were talking about why your ethical position is radical and how you think that most people wouldn't agree with the classification.
I think I remember where I was going with this. You were asking me, so the point is, we come up with certain mathematical... We build formal systems which allow us to create structures which clearly have meaning outside of the formal system, right? Mm-hmm. Claims like 1 + 1 = 2 clearly mean something. They clearly correspond to some fact about the world. Or if you manage to build something which is like the integers, then it's also like things which exist in reality, right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, the formal system is arbitrary, but arbitrary, I mean, I don't know. Non-arbitrary insofar as we have specifically defined formal systems to be like reality in some non-trivial way. There is some non-trivial map between the formal system and reality. I argue that ethics is at least like... It's ontologically like mathematics in the way that the formalists think of it, and maybe even more than that. So it's clear that we can construct formal systems and discuss things like utilitarianism. Formal systems to discuss these things really exist. I'm not just bullshitting and saying, oh, hypothetically we could make one. I mean, economists do this. They actually talk about the formal properties of utility. But then there's some mapping we have to do. So I can talk about a collection of symbols and then talk about a utility function on those symbols. But I can mean a couple things by utility function. I can mean the abstract mathematical function which takes in symbols and spits out real numbers. Or I can mean utility function in the sense that it corresponds to people's real preferences, right? So it's the same thing where there's two different kinds of claims. There are formal claims about collections of symbols, and then there are the facts about the world, which really mean something. So in the context of utilitarianism, even if it's false is immaterial, but a claim like, if I use the symbols A and B to represent two possible outcomes, right? Maybe it's the outcome where we don't implement some tax policy and some outcome where we do implement that tax policy. I can represent in the system, I can say, okay, agent 1 prefers outcome B to outcome A, and I represent that with some ordering relation. That corresponds to something about the world. Is the connection when I say ethics is like mathematics ontologically a little more clear in this respect? Yeah. There are formal statements, there are corresponding statements about reality, and then there are some statements within ethics that don't necessarily seem to correspond directly to reality. So, because this formal system is embedded in a larger language game, right? So as soon as I determine, okay, I take everybody's preferences and then I formalize them, and then I talk about those formal properties and I derive some fact, and then I turn that conclusion that I derived formally back into some informal thing about people's preferences. That's not all there is. There is also a language game component, which is, as soon as I say, okay, there is greater utility in doing this thing than in doing this thing. In this language game, there are actions into which that statement is interwoven. I am compelling people to do something. That's the sense in which you leave the formal system and start entering this broader language game. I don't think most people conceive of ethics like I just explained. I don't think they would accept this.
I absolutely see what you're saying. I think I agree mostly. I just would add the caveat that you can construct ethical systems that have the ontological status of mathematics, but not all ethical systems are. Obviously, like deontology wouldn't fit, or like Christian ethics that are just given by God wouldn't fit. Like they're just absolute statements, like coming out of the ether, not necessarily in a relation, not considering context, not doing any calculations, you know?
Yeah, well, in practice, utilitarianism is the only one for which we've really constructed a formal system
Yeah, I suppose.
in the sense of actually having done it. You know, your notion of choice consequentialism, yeah, you probably could formalize that somehow, but God knows I'm not going to, and you're probably not going to.
I could think about it.
Yeah, you could think about it, but I promise you're not going to be able to... I have the entire background of economics on my side. Like, this is such a losing... I am writing easy because when I talk about all the formal properties of utility, economists have already done this all for me.
Yeah,
right?
I suppose.
I don't have any extra work. Like I'm writing easy here. But
so to sum up, it has the same ontological status as mathematics for one reason, and this reason is that a statement like one apple and another apple make two apples is equivalent to if I give this man a blowjob, he's happier.
that was a funny example.
Ontologically.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, I guess that makes sense. Like, if we, I guess numbers are more easily observable because rational preference is like an iffy topic. But if we like assume to be able to observe it, then we can make decisions based on that. Yeah, we can make calculations based on that. We can derive something akin to mathematical equations from it. It's kind of hard to do the observation part, and I guess you're aware of this. And economists probably are painfully aware of this, so you kind of have to find like a backwards way of getting there. But
it's difficult, but far from impossible. This is where I would appeal to the work of people like Daniel Kahneman. And yes, I have actually verified that's how his name is pronounced. I hope, anyway.
The con man.
Con man, yeah. This is where, okay. Fuck, I always feel like I'm repeating myself, but this is the thing I've thought about so much that I could legitimately write like a full essay from top to bottom of how I do ethics. So this is where we start. I don't know. I mean, is this direction we're going? Do you want me to talk about like rational preference and how we actually do this in practice and the difference between experience utilities and decision utilities? Do we want to talk about this?
So let me first clarify one thing, which is so we've now established why you think your ethical approach is so radically different for most people. This is the reason.
Correct.
Okay.
I will say, I think economists are implicitly doing what I'm doing. They're just hedging their bets because they tend not to want to talk about philosophy because they're they know enough to try and not speak out of term. I am an arrogant bastard, and I think I've basically got this right. So, I would rather... I don't think I hedge the way the economists do. I think...
So, okay, can you describe the hedging economists do?
So, when they talk about utility, they will typically say, we're not making any claims as to what utility means. We are just saying that, hypothetically, humans can have rational sets of preferences, and it is interesting to study those things. Interesting and useful. That we can study these models with simplifying assumptions, and often those simplifying assumptions are, at least in some scenarios, accurate enough that they do truly predict human behavior. So, the earliest formalization of utility that I'm familiar with, and in fact, I think it's really the only formalization. I mean, it's been built on top of, but it's really the only one. Is that developed in von Neumann and Morgenstern's theory of games and economic behavior. This is where we, as far as I know, we first started talking about utility as a formal thing. They argued that because back when Bentham talked about it, you know, when you propose, you're talking a hypothetical with someone, and you sort of propose that a something has a measurable quantity to it that when it actually doesn't. So you might say like, oh, this has 10 happiness units and this has -5 happiness units. And it's useful for understanding a concept in the abstract, but in practice, that quantity isn't actually measurable. Von Neumann and Morgenstern were a little radical in saying, actually, we really can talk about this thing as a numerical quantity. Now, I could go into a slightly different thing where I think the numerical quantity is largely unimportant, but whatever. We'll get into that another time. So, if you read von Neumann and Morgenstern's book, they will essentially say, they will really hedge their bets and say, we have essentially defined utility as... Well, hold on. They will essentially say, we have defined rationality as that thing for which the calculus of expected utility is valid. I think this is the sense in which I think they're hedging their bets a little bit too much. I think they've stumbled across something a little bit deeper. I'm trying not to suddenly jump too deep into the theory and just start talking mathematics with you. But wait, what am I? All right, let me try to get to the point. What am I trying to TLDR here? Economists make no claims about the nature of utility. That's the point. Economists will try and not. They will just say there's a thing called utility. It's interesting to study. And under some assumptions, it predicts human behavior. I think you can say more. I think you can use this to do ethics.
Yeah, I would agree. That seems like the general way in which you can kind of pick an axiom that you want to like maximize. And the fact that what you mean by utility is not clearly defined makes it even better, in my opinion. It makes it a lot better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, precisely. It's the most agnostic possible.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is why I start from like the notion of a social contract, and we all get together and agree. We form this social contract where we say, okay, we want to make society better. Let's take the most agnostic approach to what better could mean. That thing is utility. Do you have preferences? As long as they're sufficiently rational, as long as they're rational enough that I can't Dutch book you, and we've talked about Dutch books, then we can talk about utility. It's the most agnostic possible notion of a society being better.
I think there's two. This is very interesting. I think regarding ethics, we have two like parallel, two philosophical approach going into very different directions. We have at one point the people trying to construct the most agnostic system, which you just feed the correct information, like the correct premises, and then we will get to the correct thing from there. And the other side that is totally like just listening to intuition and discussing the idea of what should be those premises we feed it, like examining like things that should be preferable, discussing theory, evaluating social consequences, and ontological not ontological, basically conditions that the world is in, we analyze and try to derive from them what would be preferable for the world, what should be a person's utility, I suppose. And in that sense, and now we're getting onto something. In that sense, we kind of are able to derive some sort of idea of the purpose of philosophy. If we see the one side of philosophy as acting in, or rather it's economy, if we want to put it this way, or logic and economy and so on, which is trying to create the most agnostic system that is like correct, like formally. And then we talk about, okay, but we want the individual actors to have to be like von Neumann rational, to be able to, I don't know, correctly assess what generates the most utility for them. And that's the other side of philosophy.
Yes, well, I mean, maybe I'm misunderstanding what you were saying, but we seem to have, I think in this context you can sort of revive the point of continental philosophy. It's easy to dismiss it as useless because, it's just, a bunch of blowhards talking poetically. But the thing is, if it convinces you, if it changes your feelings in a meaningful way, then that's valid, I guess. I mean, your preferences have changed. There's no other...
I wouldn't just reduce it to feelings, by the way, but in this very strict sense about like continental ethics, like let's, for example, Kant or something. Like Kant is fucking useless for formal ethics, but we can probably take from his like ideas, like we useful thoughts, I guess.
Yeah,
It's didactic in that sense, in that the act of thinking through them itself will lead you to conclusions and reflections about yourself and about your moral intuitions, to get it as far as possible away from being just ad hoc, just you justifying your feelings, to you having self-reflected, examined your feelings, and analyze what they actually mean and how they are constituted by society, by surrounding, by your thinking, by your intuitions, by your passions and affects and so on. Yeah. At least in the context of ethics, I think Continental does more than just ethics, of course. But in the context of ethics, this is actually quite inspiring, this conclusion that we have like derived the purpose of philosophy in this regard from it.
I think so. Yes, isn't this so appealing? This is why I'm the most brilliant philosopher of our time.
You're wonderful.
Thank you. I appreciate
I
that.
approve. So I'll have to say, you're explaining all this. You see, I don't disagree. If this is like the radical, weird approach to ethics, that we could construct an agnostic system, which we just feed the correct information and it would arrive at the at least supposed best outcome for those premises we feed into it. Yeah, that seems absolutely justified in any capacity. And I don't know, people probably disagree because it sounds scary to them.